Hey guys, and welcome to another Looping Reel Gaming review. If you want to see a specific review on this channel, please let us know. It can be a newly released title, or an older or even retro game that you want to see as review. Thanks. The story-driven, quick-time games by David Cage have had its share of cult following ever since the release of the game Fahrenheit, but more so from the release of Heavy Rain. After an overall negatively received Beyond Two Souls, people were hesitant if the formula that Detroit Become Human consisted of would now have been done to death. Where this type of game was more unique during the time of games like Fahrenheit and Heavy Rain, nowadays we have our fair share, including the TellTale games, Life is Strange, or the more recent early access title, The Council. What Quantic Dream always had over all these other developers was budget. There has also been an occurrence of saturation, especially with the TellTale games, where it became very apparent that the so-called choices that you made never actually changed the story all that much. The same could be said for Heavy Rain, where choices you made simply changed dialogue and reactions from characters, but the outline of all the scenes still was the same. It wasn't until the final scene where certain actions actually changed the outcome. But the graphical fidelity of that game when it was released countered that in a positive way. A notable exception to this was the game The Witcher 2, a game that does not share the same gameplay mechanics, but did have a choice at the end of the first act that drastically changed the setting, quests, and characters you would come across in the second act. With Detroit Become Human, this formula unfortunately still is not perfect, to where most of the choices you make simply change a reaction or piece of dialogue. However, this time there is more of an abundance of choices made earlier on that will actually change the setting or characters you even interact with. In comparison to Heavy Rain, with Detroit, they tried to have a bigger emphasis on certain actions from previous scenes have a consequence during later scenes. Though this seems very cool and convincing at first, when one would look at the chart flow, it will be revealed that despite a new action being unlocked due to something done in a previous chapter, the outcome of the current chapter is still the same as if you did not do the action in the previous one. The game is told from three perspectives, much more in the style of Heavy Rain, and this offers a certain gameplay opportunity that I would personally really recommend. It is not necessarily how the game is meant to be played, but it can make the experience a lot more fun and engaging. When Heavy Rain came out, which offered 4 characters, a friend and I played it together where each of us would control 2 of those characters to make it feel like a story-driven multiplayer experience. I did the same thing with Detroit Become Human, where I played the characters of Marcus and Connor, and my girlfriend, who's not into games at all, but was very intrigued by the cinematic style and easy control mechanics, played the role of Kara. This made the experience so much more engaging, as the amount of options you get in a certain scene can sometimes be absurdly much. The knowledge that any of the characters can die and the story still continue also helped with this, but that was something we already saw in games like Heavy Rain and Until Dawn. It even offered some very frantic moments when the characters of Kara and one of mine would meet each other, and we had to quickly swap controllers when control switched from character to character. Because of this, I would argue that my first playthrough of Detroit was incredibly positive and would be close to an 8 or even higher. But the real freedom one has, unfortunately, comes to light once you go through the game a second time to see if the choices actually did matter. Before I even got the game, I made peace with the fact that probably most choices made in the game would not alter the overall storyline, but instead only things within the current scene that you are playing. For example, if during a current scene you are visiting the house of a fellow police officer, and the next scene will be you and that police officer at an erotic club, there is no way to avoid going to that club in the next scene. Instead, choices you make during the scene where you enter the officer's house change some dialogue and cutscenes within that particular part. To make things a bit more awkward, there are quite a bit of scenes, especially during the first half of Marcus' storyline, that simply have only one outcome and feel painfully linear. Marcus also has by far the weakest storyline of the 3, where he has a drastic personality change as he gets involved with the android resistance. It is a story of rebellion we have seen so many times before, and it is very clear from the get-go that you can make Marcus the protagonist of the game or the vigilante fighting for the freedom of the androids. What is staggering is how Marcus has had the best interaction with the humans compared to the other two, where Connor gets looked down on by his officer peers and Kara gets physically abused by her buyer. Marcus has a beautiful father-son relationship with his mentor Carl, played by the same actor who played the android in Aliens, a very nice touch to this game. Marcus's storyline just feels forced, and it isn't until the second half where things pick up and you get more freedom and choice where things actually change. I should end with a positive note regarding the choices, as the endings are much more diverse than games like Heavy Rain or Until Dawn for that matter. According to some, there are over 99 endings, but this can sound a bit deceitful, as some of those are at the same location regarding who is alive or not, and is divided over the 3 characters. When one goes with this logic, it could be said that each character has around 30 endings, which is still a bit iffy, but at least I can say that this time you can have multiple endings that have drastic different locations and circumstances. This time the choices actually matter, but again, it's not as perfect as it sounds, as these choices all are very specific towards the end part of the game. The story is also a bit too much on the nose with its political messages towards segregation, slavery and racism by borrowing too directly from things from the real world. Separate seating locations on the bus, armbands worn by all androids, or even camps where deviant androids are sent to, all feel put in without any subtlety. Another cringy example is that as Marcus, you can literally tag walls with the text, "I have a dream." There are plenty of better, more subtle and original ways to portray these issues in a game that takes place in the future with androids. Finally though, let me end on a positive note, and that is that the game is a real looker. Some of the characters' faces look incredible. It might sound like a weird observation, but this becomes most apparent with characters who are bald. Replication of hair in video games is still far from perfect, or even good, and a character like Hank is the perfect example of this. I can see that I'm talking to Clancy Brown, the actor who played Sergeant Zim in Starship Troopers, but his hair is just not convincing. Put him next to a frightened black android you bring in for interrogation, and you could call his facial expressions photorealistic. Overall, I had a really good time with Detroit, both because I played it as a 2-player game, which I still recommend is the way to go, but also, the first time you play the game, it's just exciting as the game makes it convincing to make you believe that choices you do actually did matter earlier on. It isn't until you play it a second or third time where we get the reality of how limited that freedom really is. I hope one day David Cage and his team will be able to pull off a game where choices you make will actually change the scene that follows mid or early game, but it would seem we are still far from that. Despite that, I would argue that the game deserves an 8 if you play a 2-player. But I will have to stick for now with a 7.5 due to the limitations this genre is plagued by, which is still a decent score in my opinion. At least it is a step into the right direction from Beyond Two Souls, and hopefully, with the power of the PlayStation 5 in the future, Cage's next game will be more of what we actually want: freedom of choice.